The rain was coming down like bullets that October night when Marcus drove away, leaving me stranded at the taxi stand with nothing but a broken phone and the clothes on my back. What he didn't know was that the helicopter landing 20 minutes later would carry someone who would change both our lives forever, and the recording I'd been making of our conversation that entire evening was about to expose secrets that would shake our entire social circle to its core. My name is Isabella Chen-Morrison, and until that stormy Tuesday night I thought I knew exactly who my husband was. I was wrong about everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Waldorf Astoria's grand ballroom had never looked more elegant than it did that evening, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over Chicago's elite as they celebrated the annual Morrison Foundation Charity Gala. I should have been enjoying myself. After all, this was my family's foundation, built by my late father's tech empire. Instead, I found myself watching my husband Marcus charm potential investors, while completely ignoring the woman who'd made his legal career possible. I'd met Marcus Davidson 5 years ago when he was a struggling corporate attorney drowning in student debt and working 60-hour weeks at a mid-tier firm. Back then, he'd been grateful for my father's connections, appreciative of the doors my family name could open, and genuinely seemed to love me for who I was beyond the Morrison fortune. Tonight, watching him network with the calculated precision of a politician, I wondered when that man had disappeared. "Isabella, darling." Patricia Whitman's voice cut through my thoughts as she approached with her characteristic air of barely contained gossip. "You look absolutely radiant tonight. That Valentino gown is exquisite on you." I smiled politely, though Patricia's compliments always felt like appraisals rather than genuine warmth. As the wife of Chicago's most prominent real estate developer, she wielded social influence like a weapon, and tonight something in her demeanor suggested she was preparing to use it. "Thank you, Patricia. You look lovely as well." I glanced around the ballroom, noting how the crowd seemed to part naturally around certain couples. The power dynamics of old money versus new, established families versus social climbers. "Have you seen Marcus? He seems to have vanished into the crowd." Patricia's smile took on a predatory quality that immediately put me on alert. "Oh, I saw him about 20 minutes ago. He was having quite an intense conversation with Victoria Ashford near the auction tables. They seemed very focused on their discussion." The name hit me like ice water. Victoria Ashford was everything I wasn't: blonde, vivacious, and desperately ambitious. She'd been making aggressive moves in Chicago's legal circles since arriving from New York 6 months ago, and her reputation for targeting successful married men was already becoming legendary among the wives who mattered. "I'm sure it was just business," I replied, keeping my voice neutral while my mind raced. Marcus had been working late frequently over the past few months, claiming to be developing new corporate clients. He'd also been increasingly critical of what he called my privileged perspective on financial matters, despite the fact that my trust fund and family connections had been instrumental in building his client base. "Of course, darling. Though I have to say, Victoria seems quite taken with married men in prominent positions. Just last month, she was seen having very cozy dinners with Senator Bradley's husband. His wife was devastated when the photos surfaced." Patricia's words carried the weight of a warning wrapped in social gossip, but before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message that made my blood run cold. "Emergency at the office. Need to leave immediately. Take a taxi home. We'll explain later. Meanie names M." I stared at the message, processing its implications. Marcus had driven us to the gala in his BMW, and we'd arrived together as we always did for public events. For him to leave without even finding me to explain in person was not just rude, it was deliberately humiliating in front of Chicago's social elite. "Everything all right, dear?" Patricia asked, clearly noting my expression. "Yes, just some work emergency," I managed, though my hands were trembling as I typed back a response. "What kind of emergency?" "I'll come with you." The reply came instantly. "No. Handle this yourself for once. You're capable of getting home without me managing every detail of your life." The cruelty of those words, delivered via text while I stood in a room full of people who would notice his absence, was breathtaking in its calculated coldness. This wasn't about a work emergency. This was about something much more deliberate. I excused myself from Patricia and made my way through the ballroom, searching for Marcus to demand an explanation face to face. What I discovered instead was far worse than I'd imagined. Near the coat check area, partially hidden behind one of the venue's marble pillars, I found Marcus in conversation with Victoria Ashford. But this wasn't a business discussion. Victoria's hand was resting on his chest, and the intimacy of their body language made it clear this was a relationship that had progressed far beyond professional networking. "The foundation money will be available for reinvestment within 6 months," Marcus was saying, his voice low but audible to someone who knew how to listen carefully. "Once the trust fund transfers are complete, we'll have access to everything we discussed. Isabella won't even understand what's happening until it's too late." My legs nearly gave out as the implications hit me. Marcus wasn't just having an affair. He was discussing my family's money with his mistress, planning some kind of financial manipulation that involved my inheritance and the foundation my father had spent his life building. Victoria's laugh was soft and predatory. "She really has no idea, does she? All that money and she just lets you handle everything like a good little wife." "Isabella's always been naive about financial matters," Marcus replied with a casual cruelty that made my stomach churn. "She trusts me completely. Makes everything much easier than it would be with someone more sophisticated." I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, as I activated the voice recording app. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them immediately, but something deeper, perhaps the business sense I'd inherited from my father, warned me to gather evidence first. "The Henderson account transfers are already in motion," Marcus continued, apparently unaware that his wife was standing 15 feet away recording every word. "By the time anyone realizes what's happening, the money will be safely offshore. Isabella will be left with enough to maintain appearances, but the real assets will be beyond her reach." Victoria's voice carried a note of concern that wasn't about morality, but about logistics. "What about her family's lawyers?" "The Morrison family has had the same legal team for decades. They know every detail of her father's arrangements." "That's already handled," Marcus said with the confidence of someone who'd been planning this for months. "I've been gradually moving our legal matters to firms where I have more influence. Isabella signs whatever I put in front of her without reading the details. She actually thanked me last week for, quote, taking care of all the complicated financial stuff, while she focuses on her charity work." The recording captured every word as my husband described systematically stealing my inheritance while positioning me as an incompetent heiress who deserved to be manipulated. The foundation my father had built to help underprivileged students access technology education was apparently just another asset in Marcus's portfolio of things to steal. But the conversation that followed revealed the true scope of their plan, and it was far worse than simple theft. "Once the divorce is finalized," Victoria said, her voice taking on a business-like tone, "how long before you can liquidate the remaining assets?" My heart stopped. Divorce? They weren't just stealing my money. They were planning to destroy my life entirely, while making it look like I was the incompetent party who'd driven away a devoted husband. 6 months, maybe less," Marcus replied. "The prenup is ironclad in my favor, especially with the documentation I've been building about her emotional instability and poor decision-making. Her spending on charity projects, her refusal to engage with serious financial planning, the way she relies on me for every major decision, it all supports the narrative that she's not capable of managing significant assets. And if she fights it?" Marcus's laugh was cold and calculating. "With what? I've been her financial manager for 3 years. Every lawyer she trusts reports to me. Every financial advisor she's worked with has been selected by me. Isabella Morrison is about to learn what happens when you live in a bubble of privilege without understanding how the real world works." I stood frozen behind the pillar, recording their casual discussion of destroying my life, when Marcus's phone rang. He answered it immediately, and his tone shifted to the concerned husband persona I'd grown accustomed to. "Yes, this is Marcus Davidson. What kind of emergency?" "No, I can't bring my wife. This is sensitive legal matter. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up and turned to Victoria with a satisfied expression. "Perfect timing. That was the call we've been waiting for." The offshore accounts are ready for the final transfers. I need to leave immediately. What about Isabella? I'll text her that there's an emergency. Let her figure out how to get home. Consider it practice for the independence she's going to need very soon. As Marcus headed toward the exit, Victoria called after him softly. Marcus, are you sure about this? She seems like a decent person. There might be easier targets who deserve this more. He turned back with an expression of pure contempt. Victoria, Isabella Morrison was born into wealth she never earned, married a man she never truly understood, and has spent 5 years treating me like hired help who should be grateful for access to her family's money. She deserves exactly what she's about to get. The recording captured every word as my husband walked away, leaving me stranded not just physically, but emotionally and financially as well. What Marcus didn't know was that the naive heiress he'd been manipulating had just documented his entire conspiracy, and the storm brewing outside was nothing compared to the one I was about to unleash on his carefully constructed plans. As I stood in that marble-pillared ballroom, clutching my phone with its damning recording, I realized that Marcus Davidson had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that privilege meant ignorance, that trust meant stupidity, and that isolation meant helplessness. He was about to learn that Isabella Morrison had inherited more than just money from her father. She'd inherited his strategic mind, his business instincts, and his absolute determination to destroy anyone who tried to steal from his family. The storm outside was just beginning, but the real tempest was about to be unleashed by the woman Marcus had underestimated so completely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The October wind hit me like a slap as I pushed through the Waldorf's revolving doors, clutching my evening purse and the phone that contained evidence capable of destroying Marcus's entire scheme. The doorman, an elderly gentleman named Thomas who'd been working Chicago's luxury hotels for decades, immediately noticed my distress. "Mrs. Davidson, are you all right? Would you like me to call your car service?" I realized Marcus had been using his surname instead of mine for hotel reservations, another small sign of the control he'd been systematically establishing over my identity. "Actually, it's Mrs. Morrison," I corrected gently. "And yes, I need a taxi, please. My husband had to leave unexpectedly." Thomas's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He'd clearly witnessed enough marital drama among Chicago's elite to recognize the signs. "Of course, ma'am. Though I should mention, the Weather Service has issued a severe storm warning. The wind gusts are already reaching 40 miles per hour, and it's expected to get much worse." As if summoned by his words, a crack of thunder split the night sky, followed immediately by lightning that illuminated the churning clouds above Michigan Avenue. The storm that had been threatening all evening was finally unleashing its full fury on the city. "I'll wait under the canopy," I said, though even the hotel's expansive entrance overhang seemed inadequate protection against what was brewing overhead. Thomas nodded and reached for his phone, but his expression grew concerned as he made several calls. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm afraid the taxi companies have suspended service due to the weather conditions. The police are advising everyone to stay indoors until the storm passes." My heart sank as I realized the implications. Marcus had orchestrated this perfectly, abandoning me on a night when alternative transportation would be nearly impossible to find. Whether he'd planned it this way or simply taken advantage of the weather, the result was the same. I was stranded. "How long until the storm passes?" I asked, though the intensifying wind and rain suggested this wasn't a brief squall. "Weather Service is saying at least 3 hours, possibly longer. The hotel would be happy to arrange a room for you, of course." I considered this option, but something about returning to the safety of the hotel felt like surrender. Marcus expected me to be helpless, to wait passively for rescue or retreat to comfort until someone else solved my problems. The recording on my phone had revealed exactly what he thought of my capabilities, and every fiber of my being rebelled against proving him right. "No, thank you. I'll find another way." Thomas looked genuinely worried now. "Mrs. Morrison, with respect, this isn't the kind of weather for walking. Even with an umbrella, you'd be soaked through in minutes, and the wind is strong enough to knock someone down." He was right, of course, but as I stood under that canopy watching the storm rage, a memory surfaced that changed my perspective entirely. When I was 12 years old, My father had taken me to visit one of his tech manufacturing facilities during a similar storm. The power had gone out, and while the adults panicked about lost productivity and damaged equipment, my father had calmly implemented backup protocols that not only saved the day but improved the facility's efficiency permanently. Isabella, he'd told me that day, storms reveal who you really are. Some people run for shelter and wait for someone else to fix their problems. Others see storms as opportunities to discover what they're truly capable of. Standing outside the Waldorf 23 years later, I realized this storm was my opportunity to discover what Isabella Morrison was truly capable of when she stopped being Mrs. Marcus Davidson. "Thomas," I said, making a decision that would change everything, "is there a taxi stand further down Michigan Avenue? Somewhere the drivers might still be working despite the weather?" His expression suggested he thought I'd lost my mind, but years of customer service had taught him when to argue and when to provide information. "There's a stand at the Intercontinental, about 6 blocks north. The drivers there handle airport runs, so they might still be operating. But Mrs. Morrison, in this weather..." "Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to know." Before Thomas could protest further, I stepped out from under the canopy and into the full force of the storm. The wind immediately tried to rip my evening gown, and the rain soaked through the delicate fabric within seconds. My designer heels, perfect for ballroom floors, became treacherous on wet pavement, but I pressed forward with determination I didn't know I possessed. Michigan Avenue, usually bustling with late-night traffic and pedestrians, was eerily deserted. The few cars I saw were moving cautiously, their headlights cutting through sheets of rain that reduced visibility to mere yards. Street lights flickered ominously, and twice I heard the crack of tree branches giving way to the wind. By the second block, I was soaked to the skin and questioning my sanity. My phone, mercifully protected in a waterproof case I'd bought for charity runs, buzzed with a text message. Even through the storm, Marcus's cruelty found its way to me. "Hope you're enjoying your independence. This is good practice for what's coming. My kid of M." The message confirmed that stranding me in the storm had been intentional, but it also revealed something Marcus didn't realize he was showing me. He was monitoring my situation closely enough to know I hadn't simply returned to the hotel or called friends for help. That suggested he was either still nearby or had someone watching me. "Lois." I stopped under the awning of a closed boutique and carefully activated my phone's recording app again. If Marcus was tracking my movements, if this abandonment was part of his larger scheme to document my supposed incompetence, then I wanted evidence of his deliberate cruelty when the time came to present my case. "It's 11:47 p.m. on October 15th, I said clearly, holding the phone close to my mouth to capture my voice over the storm. "I'm walking north on Michigan Avenue in a severe thunderstorm because my husband Marcus Davidson abandoned me at the Waldorf Astoria. He texted me to, quote, take a taxi home, knowing that taxi service has been suspended due to weather conditions. This appears to be a deliberate attempt to put me in danger and document my supposed inability to handle difficult situations. A particularly violent gust of wind nearly knocked me off balance, and I grabbed the boutique's door handle to steady myself. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, creating evidence to counter Marcus's narrative about my incompetence, while standing in a storm that any reasonable person would consider dangerous. But as I resumed walking, something unexpected happened. The physical challenge of fighting through the storm, the clarity that came from having a concrete goal, and the knowledge that I was finally taking action instead of being acted upon, created a surge of strength I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since my father's death 3 years ago, I felt like Isabella Morrison instead of Marcus Davidson's wife. The next 3 blocks tested that newfound strength as the storm intensified. Wind gusts strong enough to rattle storefront windows made every step a battle. And the rain had turned Michigan Avenue into a series of deep puddles that soaked through my evening shoes. Twice I had to take shelter in building alcoves when lightning strikes came close enough to make the air smell of ozone. But with each block, my determination grew stronger. Marcus had counted on my privileged background, making me helpless in difficult situations. He'd assumed that a woman who'd never had to struggle would crumble at the first real challenge. What he'd failed to understand was that my father hadn't raised me to be ornamental. He'd raised me to be resilient. The Intercontinental Hotel finally came into view, its illuminated entrance a beacon through the storm. The taxi stand Thomas had mentioned was indeed still operational, though only one cab remained. its driver apparently crazy enough or desperate enough to continue working in these conditions. As I approached the vehicle, the driver, a middle-aged African-American woman with silver-streaked hair, rolled down her window and looked at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. "Honey, are you out of your mind?" she called over the wind. "This storm is dangerous enough to keep most people indoors, and you're walking around in a ball gown like you're heading to a party." "I was at a party," I replied, raising my voice to be heard. "My husband left me stranded, and I need to get home to Lincoln Park." The driver studied my face for a moment, and something in her expression suggested she'd seen enough domestic situations to recognize the signs. "Get in before you catch pneumonia. Name's Dorothy Williams, and I've been driving this city for 25 years. Seen a lot of storms, but not many women brave enough to walk through one because their husband's acting like a fool." As I settled into the back seat, grateful for the warmth and shelter, Dorothy handed me a towel from her front seat. "You want to tell me what really happened, or should I just drive and mind my own business?" Something about her straightforward manner and genuine concern broke through the emotional walls I'd been maintaining all evening. "My husband is stealing my inheritance and planning to divorce me. He left me at the Waldorf tonight as some kind of test or punishment. I think he wanted me to prove I couldn't handle myself without him." Dorothy glanced at me in the rearview mirror as she pulled away from the hotel. "Sounds like you're proving exactly the opposite. Takes backbone to walk 6 blocks in a storm like this rather than wait for someone else to rescue you." As we drove through the empty streets toward Lincoln Park, Dorothy shared observations that revealed a wisdom earned through decades of navigating Chicago's streets and the human dramas that played out in her taxi. 25 years of driving, I've seen all kinds of people in all kinds of situations," she said, expertly navigating around a fallen tree branch. "The ones who surprise me most are the folks who think they're helpless until circumstances force them to discover they're not. Sounds like tonight might be one of those discovery moments for you." Her words resonated deeply as we approached my neighborhood. The storm that Marcus had used as a weapon against me was revealing strengths I'd forgotten I possessed. But as Dorothy turned onto my street, she suddenly slowed the taxi and pointed toward the sky. "Now that's something you don't see every day," she said with obvious awe. Through the rain and darkness, helicopter lights were visible in the distance, growing larger as the aircraft approached. But this wasn't a news helicopter or police aircraft. The lights were too bright, too sophisticated, and it was flying with the kind of precision that suggested military or high-end corporate equipment. "Ma'am," Dorothy said, her voice carrying a note of excitement, "I think that helicopter is heading for your neighborhood. In weather like this, that's either an emergency or someone very important who doesn't let storms change their schedule." As we watched, the helicopter descended toward what appeared to be the small park across from my house, its powerful rotors fighting against the wind with impressive skill. The aircraft's lights illuminated the storm around it, creating a dramatic scene that looked like something from a movie. "Mrs. Morrison," Dorothy said, using my name for the first time, "I've got a feeling your evening is about to take a very interesting turn." She was right, though neither of us could have imagined just how dramatically that helicopter landing would change not just my night but the entire trajectory of my life, and the fate of Marcus's carefully constructed scheme. As we pulled into my driveway, the helicopter touched down in the park with professional precision, its lights still cutting through the storm like beacons of hope in the darkness that had become my life. Dorothy insisted on waiting in her taxi until I was safely inside my house, her maternal instincts clearly activated by what she'd witnessed tonight. As I fumbled with my keys, hands still shaking from cold and adrenaline, the helicopter's rotors continued their rhythmic beat across the street, creating an almost hypnotic soundtrack to the storm. "You sure you're going to be all right, honey?" Dorothy called through her partially lowered window. "That husband of yours might come back tonight, and given what you told me about his behavior, I'm not sure you should be alone." Before I could respond, my phone rang. The caller ID made my stomach drop. Marcus Davidson, home. He was calling from our landline, which meant he was already inside the house. My house. The house my father had bought and put in my name 5 years ago, before I'd even met Marcus. "He's already here," I told Dorothy, holding up the phone so she could see the display. Dorothy's expression hardened immediately. You want me to call the police? Or stay until you know what kind of mood he's in? I considered both options, but something about the helicopter's presence across the street made me feel less vulnerable than I had an hour ago. No, I need to face this. But, Dorothy, could I get your number? In case I need a friend tonight. She immediately handed me her business card. Anytime, day or night. And honey, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't wait to get help. As Dorothy's taxi disappeared into the storm, I took a deep breath and answered the phone. Marcus's voice carried a tone I'd never heard before. Barely controlled panic, masked as anger. Where the hell have you been, Isabella? I've been calling for an hour, walking through a storm to get home. Since my husband abandoned me at a hotel, I replied, surprised by the steel in my own voice. Where exactly did you expect me to be? Don't be dramatic. You could have stayed at the hotel or called any number of friends. You didn't need to pull some kind of independence stunt just to make a point. The casual dismissal of what I'd just endured crystallized something inside me. Marcus truly saw my struggle as performance rather than necessity, my strength as rebellion rather than survival. It was exactly the kind of perspective that had allowed him to justify stealing from me. Less. I'm coming inside now, I said, ending the call before he could respond. The moment I opened the front door, I knew something was wrong. Our house, my house, felt different. Not just because Marcus was there radiating tension, but because things had been moved. Subtle changes that might have escaped notice if I hadn't been hypersensitive to every detail since discovering his betrayal. The stack of mail on the entrance table had been rifled through. The drawer where I kept important documents was slightly open. Most telling of all, my father's old desk in the study, a piece Marcus never touched, showed signs of recent searching. You're soaked, Marcus said, appearing in the hallway with an expression that might have passed for concern if I hadn't spent the evening listening to him plan my destruction. You should get into some dry clothes before you catch pneumonia. What were you looking for? I asked directly, water still dripping from my evening gown onto the marble foyer. What do you mean? The mail has been searched, the document drawer is open, and someone has been through my father's desk. Since you were supposedly handling a legal emergency, I'm curious why you had time to ransack our house. Marcus's mask slipped for just a moment, a flash of guilt before the concerned husband persona reasserted itself. Isabella, you're clearly upset about tonight. You're seeing things that aren't there. Am I? Then you won't mind if I check to see if anything is missing from the safe. The color drained from Marcus's face. Our home safe contained the original copies of my father's will, my trust fund documentation, and other financial records that Marcus had been systematically replacing with versions that gave him greater control. If he'd been searching the house, those documents were likely his target. Of course not, he said, but his voice carried a note of desperation. Though maybe we should talk first. About tonight, about everything. I think there's been some misunderstandings. Before I could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Both Marcus and I froze. It was nearly 1 a.m., and the storm was still raging outside. No one should be making social calls in these conditions. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, followed by a voice that carried authority despite being muffled by the wind and rain. Mrs. Morrison? This is James Sullivan from Sullivan International. I apologize for the late hour, but we have urgent business to discuss. My mind raced trying to place the name. Sullivan International was a global consulting firm that specialized in corporate security and asset protection. They'd done some work for my father's company years ago, but I couldn't imagine why they'd be at my door in the middle of a storm. Marcus stepped protectively in front of me, which would have seemed gallant if I didn't know his true motivations. Isabella, don't answer it. It's probably some kind of scam. No legitimate business operates at this hour. But something about the voice outside suggested authenticity, and the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. The helicopter across the street, the urgent business visit, Marcus's obvious panic. These elements were connected in ways I was only beginning to understand. I moved past Marcus and opened the door to reveal a man in his 50s, impeccably dressed despite the storm, flanked by 2 associates who carried themselves like former military personnel. His steel-gray hair and weathered face suggested someone who'd spent decades handling crises for people with my kind of money. Mrs. Morrison, I'm James Sullivan. I knew your father well. He hired my firm several times for sensitive matters. I apologize for the dramatic arrival, but we have reason to believe you're in immediate danger. Marcus stepped forward aggressively. This is ridiculous. Isabella, don't listen to whatever scam. Mr. Davidson. Sullivan interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that stopped arguments cold. I think you'll want to hear what we have to say. It concerns the Morrison Foundation accounts, the offshore transfers you've been arranging, and the individual you've been working with who isn't quite who she claims to be. The silence that followed was deafening, except for the storm still raging outside. Marcus had gone completely white, and I realized that whatever Sullivan knew, it went far deeper than even the conspiracy I'd uncovered at the gala. May we come in? Sullivan asked. The matter is time-sensitive, and there are some things Mrs. Morrison needs to understand about her current situation. I stepped aside to let them enter, noting how Marcus seemed to shrink back as Sullivan's team moved through our foyer with the efficient awareness of people accustomed to danger. Mrs. Morrison, Sullivan began once we were settled in the living room. 3 months ago, your father's old business partner, Robert Chen, contacted our firm with concerns about unusual activities surrounding your financial accounts. As you may remember, Mr. Chen maintained a friendship with your father and felt a responsibility to monitor threats to your welfare. Robert Chen had been my father's closest friend and business partner for over 20 years. After my father's death, Robert had moved to Hong Kong to manage the Asian operations of their tech empire, but he'd stayed in touch and had always treated me like a beloved niece. What kind of unusual activity? I asked, though Marcus's increasingly panicked expression suggested I already knew the answer. Systematic manipulation of your trust fund documentation, unauthorized communications with your financial advisors, and most concerning, preliminary arrangements for moving significant assets to overseas accounts that would be beyond the reach of U.S. courts. Sullivan pulled out a tablet and showed me documents I'd never seen before. Transfer authorizations bearing my forged signature, revised trust fund terms that dramatically reduced my control over my own inheritance, and communications between Marcus and financial institutions discussing my supposed diminished capacity following my father's death. The individual your husband has been working with, Victoria Ashford, isn't simply an ambitious attorney, Sullivan continued. She's part of an international network that specializes in what they call inheritance restructuring. They target wealthy widows and heirs, create compromising situations, then systematically transfer assets before disappearing. The room spun slightly as the full scope of what I'd discovered tonight expanded beyond simple infidelity and theft into something approaching organized crime. How many people have they done this to? I whispered. At least 12 that we've documented over the past 3 years, Sullivan replied grimly. The pattern is always similar. Identify a vulnerable target, place an attractive accomplice in their social circle, compromise the target's spouse or family member, then execute a coordinated asset strip that leaves the victim financially and legally isolated. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled protest. This is insane. Isabella, these people are obviously trying to manipulate you. You know me. We've been married for 5 years. I would never. Mr. Davidson, Sullivan interrupted. We have recordings of your conversations with Ms. Ashford discussing Mrs. Morrison's emotional fragility and your plans to have her declared incompetent. We also have documentation of the $500,000 you've already transferred to preliminary offshore accounts, using your wife's credentials and forged authorizations. The number hit me like a physical blow. $500,000. Money my father had earned through decades of innovation and hard work, stolen by the man I'd trusted with my life and my future. But Sullivan wasn't finished. Most importantly, Mrs. Morrison, we have reason to believe that tonight's abandonment was intended to be permanent. The plan wasn't simply to leave you stranded in the storm. It was to ensure you never made it home alive. The words hung in the air like poison as their full implications sank in. Marcus hadn't just been stealing my money and planning to divorce me. He'd been planning to kill me. That's impossible, I said, though even as I spoke, pieces were clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The storm providing perfect cover, Marcus's detailed knowledge of my location, the way he'd isolated me from friends and family over the past months. Sullivan's expression was grimly compassionate. Mrs. Morrison, your taxi driver tonight, Dorothy Williams, contacted our emergency line after dropping you off. She'd been approached yesterday by someone offering her money to drive you to a specific location tonight, claiming it was for a surprise party. When she refused and took a different route, she likely saved your life. The revelation hit me like ice water. Even Dorothy, the wise woman who'd become my unexpected ally, had been part of someone's plan. The only reason I was alive was because she'd had the integrity to refuse a bribe and the wisdom to recognize danger. Marcus was backing toward the door now, his face a mask of desperation and calculation. Isabella, you can't believe this. These people are obviously trying to drive a wedge between us for their own reasons. You know I love you. Everything I've done has been to protect you, to handle the complexities you're not equipped to deal with. Like the way you protected me tonight when you left me in a storm? I asked, my voice carrying a strength I didn't know I possessed. That was never supposed to happen the way it did, Marcus said, and for the first time, he was telling something close to the truth. The plan was different. You were supposed to be safe. Sullivan stepped forward, his team moving to block Marcus's path to the door. Mr. Davidson, I think it's time you understood that Mrs. Morrison has been under protective surveillance for the past week. Every move you've made, every conversation you've had with Ms. Ashford, every financial transaction you've attempted, we have records of all of it. The fight went out of Marcus like air from a punctured balloon. He'd been so focused on manipulating me that he'd never considered someone might be watching him. But the night's revelations were far from over. As Sullivan pulled out his phone to contact what I assumed would be law enforcement, he paused and looked at me with an expression that suggested the most important information was yet to come. Mrs. Morrison, there's one more thing you need to know. The reason we were able to intervene tonight, the reason Mr. Chen was able to alert us to the danger, your father didn't just leave you money. He left you a protection system that's been operating in the background since his death, waiting for the moment when you might need it most. As the implications of those words sank in, I realized that the storm that had nearly destroyed me had actually been the catalyst for revealing strengths and protections I'd never known existed. My father, even from beyond the grave, had been watching over me with the same strategic mind that had built his empire. The helicopter across the street, the timely arrival of Sullivan's team, even Dorothy's refusal to accept a bribe, none of it had been coincidence. It had been the activation of a safety net my father had woven around me, triggered by the very betrayal that was supposed to destroy me. Marcus Davidson had thought he was manipulating a helpless heiress. Instead, he'd walked into a trap that had been waiting 3 years for someone exactly like him to spring it. Sullivan's tablet revealed a level of surveillance that would have been invasive if it hadn't been protecting me from systematic destruction. Screen after screen showed Marcus's activities over the past 3 months. Bank visits where he'd used forged documents, meetings with Victoria Ashford in hotels across the city, and most chilling of all, consultations with what appeared to be a professional who specialized in making deaths look accidental. Mrs. Morrison, what you're seeing represents 3 months of documentation, Sullivan explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too many similar cases. Your father's instructions were specific. If anyone attempted to manipulate your inheritance or endanger your welfare, we were to gather irrefutable evidence before intervening. Marcus had been pacing near the window, but now he spun around with renewed desperation. Isabella, think about this logically. Your father has been dead for 3 years. How could he have predicted any of this? These people are clearly running some kind of elaborate con. But as I studied the tablet's contents, details emerged that only someone with intimate knowledge of my father's methods could have arranged. The surveillance reports included observations about my daily routines, my emotional state following my father's death, and, most tellingly, assessments of Marcus's character that had proven remarkably prescient. Subject exhibits classic patterns of financial parasitism, read one report, dated just 6 months into our marriage. Recommendation: continue monitoring for escalation of controlling behaviors and potential asset manipulation. Sullivan noticed my focus on that particular entry. Your father's instructions included psychological profiles of anyone who entered your inner circle. Mr. Davidson's pattern of behavior was flagged as high risk within the first year of your relationship. Then why didn't someone warn me? I asked, feeling a surge of anger at being protected through surveillance rather than information. Because your father understood something crucial about independence and strength, Sullivan replied. He believed that true protection came from allowing people to discover their own resilience while providing safety nets they could activate when needed. Tonight you proved his theory correct. As if summoned by Sullivan's words, his phone buzzed with what was clearly an urgent message. He read it quickly, his expression growing darker. Mrs. Morrison, we need to move quickly now. Victoria Ashford and 2 associates are currently en route to this address. They appear to believe that Mr. Davidson has obtained the documents they need to complete the asset transfers. Marcus's face went white. Victoria's coming here, now? But I told her. You told her you'd have the trust fund documentation and Mrs. Morrison's updated will by midnight, Sullivan interrupted, consulting his tablet. When you texted her about complications, she decided to handle the situation personally. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying clarity. Victoria wasn't just Marcus's mistress and co-conspirator, she was his handler. He'd been as manipulated as I had, just in a different way. The realization transformed my anger into something approaching pity for the man who'd tried to destroy my life. Marcus, I said, surprising myself with the gentleness in my voice. How deep are you in with these people? What do they have on you? For a moment, the mask of concerned husband and calculating thief fell away completely, revealing something I'd never seen before. Genuine terror. Isabella, you don't understand what Victoria and her people are capable of. They don't just steal money and disappear, they eliminate loose ends. If they think I've betrayed them or failed to deliver what I promised. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications hung in the air as Sullivan's team moved into defensive positions around the house with military precision. Mr. Davidson, Sullivan said firmly, if you cooperate fully with our debriefing, we can offer you protection in exchange for testimony against the network. But that offer expires the moment Ms. Ashford arrives. Marcus looked between Sullivan and me, clearly calculating his options and finding them all terrifying. What kind of testimony? Everything. How they recruited you, the other targets they're working, their methods for moving stolen assets, and most importantly, the identities of their financial networks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. As Marcus wrestled with his decision, I found myself studying his face and seeing a different kind of victim, someone who'd been seduced by easy money and then trapped by people far more dangerous than he'd realized. It didn't excuse his betrayal, but it explained the desperation that had driven him to consider murder as a solution. Isabella? Marcus said suddenly, his voice cracking with emotion I'd never heard before. I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you. When I first met Victoria, it seemed like a victimless crime. Your trust fund generates more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. The plan was to take just enough to solve my problems and disappear. You would never have missed it. But that's not what happened, I said, though without the anger I'd expected to feel. No, Victoria's people don't work that way. Once they have their hooks in someone, the demands keep escalating. First, it was access to your accounts. Then it was documentation of your supposed incompetence. Finally, they wanted everything, including making sure you couldn't fight back. Sullivan's phone buzzed again, and this time his expression conveyed immediate urgency. They're 2 blocks away. Mrs. Morrison, we need to make a decision now about how to handle this confrontation. The options he presented revealed the true scope of the danger we faced. Victoria Ashford and her team weren't simply white-collar criminals. They were people who'd killed to protect their operations and wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. We can evacuate you immediately, Sullivan explained. The helicopter team is standing by to extract you to a secure location while law enforcement handles the arrests. It's the safest option. Or, I asked, sensing there was another choice. We can use this confrontation to gather evidence that will help us shut down their entire network. Victoria believes she's walking into a situation she controls. If we let her proceed with her plan while recording everything, we'll have evidence to prosecute not just her, but the entire international operation. The second option would require me to stay in the house and face the woman who'd been planning my destruction. essentially using myself as bait to catch bigger predators. Every rational instinct screamed that I should choose evacuation and safety. But as I looked around the living room where my father had taught me to play chess, where he'd shared stories about building his company through calculated risks and strategic thinking, I realized that running away would be betraying everything he'd tried to teach me about courage and responsibility. "I'll stay," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "But I want Marcus to understand something first." I turned to face my husband directly, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our marriage. "Marcus, the money you've been stealing, it's not just my inheritance. It funds scholarships for kids whose parents can't afford technology education. It supports research into making internet access available in underserved communities. When you steal from the Morrison Foundation, you're taking opportunities away from people who need them most." The shame that washed over Marcus's face was genuine, but it was too late for remorse to change anything. The damage had been done, and the consequences were about to arrive at our front door. Sullivan's team moved through the house with practiced efficiency, placing recording devices and positioning themselves to capture everything that was about to unfold. Within minutes, our home had been transformed into an elaborate trap designed to catch international criminals. "Mrs. Morrison," Sullivan said as his team completed their preparations, "once Victoria arrives, you need to let her believe that Marcus has been successful in manipulating you. Act confused, dependent, willing to sign whatever documents she presents. The more evidence we capture of their methods, the stronger our case becomes." "And Marcus?" I asked, looking at the man who'd tried to destroy my life and was now potentially risking his own to help stop the people who'd used him. "Mr. Davidson will play his assigned role, the devoted husband who's been protecting his wife from complex financial matters she couldn't understand. If he performs convincingly, we might all survive this encounter." As if summoned by our conversation, the doorbell rang with the kind of authoritative chime that suggested the people outside weren't accustomed to waiting for permission to enter. "Showtime," Sullivan murmured, as his team faded into positions where they could observe and record without being detected. Marcus straightened his shoulders and walked toward the door, transforming himself back into the concerned husband persona, with an ease that reminded me how completely he'd been able to deceive me for 3 years. I took a deep breath and prepared to face Victoria Ashford, the woman who'd been orchestrating my destruction from the shadows, who'd turned my husband into a weapon against me, and who was about to discover that the helpless heiress she'd been planning to eliminate had been learning some very dangerous lessons about survival. The storm outside was finally beginning to subside, but the real tempest was just beginning inside our house. Victoria Ashford was about to walk into a trap that would expose not just her individual crimes, but an entire network that had been destroying lives for profit. My father had always told me that the most important battles were fought not with strength, but with intelligence and preparation. Tonight I was about to discover whether 3 years of surveillance and planning would be enough to stop people who'd made killing their profession. As Marcus opened the door, I realized that everything that had happened tonight, the abandonment in the storm, the helicopter landing, the revelations about the theft and conspiracy, had been leading to this moment. The helpless woman Victoria expected to find would instead be someone who'd learned to transform vulnerability into strength and betrayal into justice. The final act of Marcus Davidson's conspiracy was about to begin, but this time I would be writing the ending. Victoria Ashford entered my home like she owned it, her confidence radiating the kind of predatory energy that had probably intimidated dozens of victims before me. She was even more striking in person than she'd appeared at the gala. Tall, elegant, with the kind of practiced beauty that served as both weapon and camouflage. Behind her followed 2 men who carried themselves with the controlled alertness of professional security, their eyes systematically cataloging exits and potential threats. "Marcus, darling," Victoria said, her voice carrying honeyed warmth that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "I was beginning to worry when you didn't answer my calls. And this must be the famous Isabella Morrison." She extended a manicured hand toward me with a smile that would have seemed genuine if I hadn't spent the evening learning exactly what she was capable of. "Mrs. Davidson, isn't it? Though I understand you prefer to use your maiden name for business purposes." The subtle correction was deliberate. establishing dominance by demonstrating knowledge of personal details, while simultaneously diminishing my identity to that of Marcus's wife. It was exactly the kind of psychological manipulation Sullivan had warned me to expect. "Ms. Ashford," I replied, accepting her handshake while noting the strength in her grip and the way her eyes assessed me like a predator evaluating prey. "Marcus mentioned you were helping with some legal complications, though I have to say the timing seems unusual for business matters." Victoria's laugh was perfectly modulated, conveying just the right mixture of apology and urgency. "I know how this must appear, but unfortunately, international financial regulations don't observe normal business hours. When opportunities arise for asset protection, especially in today's economic climate, timing becomes critical." She moved through my living room with the familiarity of someone who'd studied its layout in advance, positioning herself where she could observe both Marcus and me while keeping the exits within her peripheral vision. Her associates took positions that seemed casual but effectively controlled the room's dynamics. "Isabella," Marcus said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone he'd perfected over 3 years of marriage. "Victoria has been helping us restructure some of your father's more complex financial arrangements. There are tax implications and international regulations that require immediate attention." I forced myself to appear confused and slightly overwhelmed, the role Sullivan had coached me to play. "I thought our accountants were handling all of that." "Mr. Patterson has been managing the Morrison accounts for 15 years. "Ah, yes, Patterson," Victoria interjected smoothly. "Wonderful man, very traditional approach to wealth management. But Mrs. Davidson, the financial landscape has evolved significantly since your father's time. Modern asset protection requires more sophisticated strategies." She opened an elegant leather briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents that looked impressively official. "What we're proposing is a restructuring that will protect your inheritance from potential future challenges while optimizing the tax benefits for your charitable work." As Victoria spread the papers across my coffee table, I caught glimpses of the true scope of her operation. These weren't simple asset transfers. They were elaborate shell game arrangements designed to move money through multiple international jurisdictions before finally landing in accounts that would be effectively beyond the reach of U.S. law enforcement. "The process does require some urgency," Victoria continued, her tone becoming slightly more pressing. "There are filing deadlines with the Cayman authorities that can't be extended, and the Swiss banking regulations require documentation to be submitted before the end of this month." I pretended to study the documents while actually searching for the recording devices Sullivan's team had positioned throughout the room. The papers Victoria had presented were masterfully crafted forgeries that would have fooled anyone without specific training in financial fraud detection. "This seems very complicated," I said, injecting just the right note of uncertainty into my voice. "Maybe I should have my lawyers review everything before signing anything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as Victoria's mask slipped almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Davidson, I understand your caution, but involving additional parties at this stage could compromise the confidentiality requirements that make these protections effective. The beauty of this structure is its discretion." Marcus stepped forward with what I now recognized as practiced timing. "Pip, sweetheart, Victoria has already coordinated with the necessary legal authorities. She's been doing this kind of work for years, specializing in protecting wealthy families from exactly the kind of challenges your father was concerned about." "Mrs. Davidson," the silver-haired associate added, "we understand this feels rushed, but unfortunately, the international banking deadlines can't be negotiated. If we miss this window, the protective structures we've designed become significantly more expensive and complex to implement." I looked at Marcus, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed anxiety. "What do you think, honey? You know I trust your judgment about these things." The relief in Marcus's eyes was genuine as he moved to support Victoria's pressure campaign. "Isabella, I think we should move forward tonight. Victoria's people have been working on this for months, and the protections they're offering are exactly what your father would have wanted." But as Marcus spoke, I caught something in his expression that Victoria missed, a subtle plea for understanding, as if he was trying to communicate something beyond his words. It took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. Marcus was terrified, not just of Victoria, but of what would happen to me if I didn't sign the documents. Mrs. Davidson, Victoria said, producing an expensive pen from her briefcase. I know this feels overwhelming, but sometimes protecting the things we love requires trusting the people who have the expertise to help us. As she held out the pen, our eyes met directly for the first time that evening. What I saw there was pure predatory calculation, the look of someone who'd convinced countless people to sign away their financial independence and was confident she was about to add another victim to her list. But Victoria Ashford had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that the confusion and vulnerability she was seeing were genuine, that the hesitant heiress sitting across from her was exactly what she appeared to be. She had no idea that every word she'd spoken had been recorded, that her entire operation was being documented by people with the resources and expertise to dismantle her network, or that the woman she was trying to manipulate had spent the evening discovering reserves of strength and determination she'd never known she possessed. As I reached for the pen Victoria was offering, I realized that the moment of decision had arrived. Everything that happened next would determine not just my own fate, but the fate of all the future victims Victoria and her network would target if they weren't stopped. The helpless heiress Victoria expected to find was about to reveal herself as something far more dangerous, a woman who'd learned to transform betrayal into justice and vulnerability into strength. I held Victoria's expensive pen in my hand for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until I could feel the tension radiating from everyone in the room. Victoria's confidence was beginning to show hairline cracks as my hesitation extended beyond what her psychological playbook had prepared her for. Mrs. Davidson, she said, her voice carrying the first hint of strain, is there something specific that's concerning you about the documentation? I looked up from the papers with what I hoped appeared to be innocent confusion. Actually, yes. There's something I don't understand about the beneficiary arrangements. It says here that if anything happens to me, the assets transfer to something called the Morrison Charitable Trust in the Cayman Islands. But my father's foundation is incorporated in Delaware. The room went dead silent. Victoria's associates exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the significance of my observation, while Marcus went visibly pale. I'd just identified the centerpiece of their theft operation, the fake charitable trust that would funnel my inheritance directly into accounts they controlled. That's an excellent question, Victoria stammered, clearly not expecting me to actually read the documents, much less understand their implications. The Cayman structure provides enhanced privacy protections for charitable giving. Many wealthy families prefer offshore foundations for their philanthropic work. Really? I asked, maintaining my naive tone while watching Victoria scramble to explain the unexplainable. Because when I called the Morrison Foundation offices yesterday to discuss expanding our scholarship programs, Director Harrison mentioned they'd received some very strange inquiries about transferring assets to Caribbean accounts. The lie was perfect, specific enough to sound authentic, threatening enough to shake Victoria's confidence, and delivered with just the right mixture of confusion and concern to maintain my helpless heiress persona. Victoria's silver-haired associate stepped forward aggressively. Mrs. Davidson, these technical details are exactly why you need professional guidance. The nuances of international charitable structures are regulated by the IRS and require specific documentation that I don't see here, I interrupted, letting some steel enter my voice for the first time that evening. My father might have been protective, but he wasn't careless about teaching me to recognize official documentation. The mask was starting to slip, and I could see Victoria calculating whether to continue the charade or shift to more direct intimidation. Marcus was watching the exchange with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that the evening was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Isabella, Marcus said urgently, maybe we should just review everything more carefully tomorrow. Victoria and her team could come back when we've had more time to. No, Victoria cut him off sharply, her pleasant demeanor finally cracking. Marcus, we discussed this. The filing deadlines are real, and delays at this point could compromise everything we've worked for. The slip was exactly what Sullivan's recording equipment needed, Victoria admitting that she and Marcus had been coordinating this operation in advance, that there was a larger plan that required my immediate cooperation. Worked for? I asked innocently. I thought this was about protecting my inheritance, not something you've been working on. Victoria realized her mistake immediately and tried to recover. Of course, Mrs. Davidson. What I meant was that preparing these protective structures requires extensive advance planning to ensure they comply with all relevant regulations. But the damage was done, and we all knew it. The recording devices had captured Victoria admitting to coordination with Marcus, revealing the premeditated nature of their scheme. I stood up slowly, setting the pen down on the coffee table with deliberate precision. Ms. Ashford, I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about this evening. What kind of misunderstanding? Victoria asked, her voice now carrying a note of genuine concern. You seem to believe that I'm a naive heiress who can be manipulated into signing away her inheritance by charming criminals who underestimate her intelligence. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Victoria's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally, cold calculation as she understood that her cover had been blown. Mrs. Davidson, she said carefully, I'm not sure what you think you've discovered, but I know exactly what I've discovered, I replied, my voice growing stronger with each word. I know that you're part of an international fraud network that targets wealthy widows and heirs. I know that you seduced my husband into helping you steal my inheritance. I know that the documents you're asking me to sign would transfer my assets to accounts you control in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. Victoria's associates were now positioning themselves more aggressively, their casual observer poses transforming into the alert stances of people preparing for confrontation. Most importantly, I continued, meeting Victoria's eyes directly, I know that you've been planning to kill me once the asset transfers were complete, because dead victims don't file complaints with law enforcement. The accusation hit the room like lightning. Marcus made a strangled sound of protest, but Victoria's reaction confirmed everything Sullivan had told me about the network's methods. Her face showed no shock or denial, only the calculating assessment of someone whose plans had been exposed. Mrs. Davidson, Victoria said, her voice now carrying undisguised menace, you seem to have developed some very dramatic theories about a routine financial consultation. Perhaps the stress of managing your inheritance has affected your judgment more than anyone realized. She was falling back on the mental incompetence narrative they'd planned to use against me. But without the element of surprise, it sounded desperate rather than convincing. My judgment is fine, I replied calmly, which is why I can tell the difference between legitimate financial advisors and criminals who've already stolen $500,000 from my accounts using forged documents. The specific number hit Victoria like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed facade cracked completely as she realized I had detailed knowledge of their operations. How did you? She began, then caught herself. How did I know? I finished for her. Because, Ms. Ashford, while you've been planning my destruction, other people have been planning yours. As if summoned by my words, James Sullivan emerged from the hallway where he'd been positioned to monitor the conversation. His appearance was so perfectly timed that Victoria actually stepped backward in shock. Good evening, Ms. Ashford, Sullivan said with professional courtesy that carried an undertone of satisfaction. I'm James Sullivan from Sullivan International. I believe we have quite a lot to discuss. Victoria's associates immediately moved to flank her, their hands moving toward concealed weapons, but Sullivan raised a calming hand. Gentlemen, I should mention that this house is currently surrounded by federal agents, and everything you've said tonight has been recorded for evidence. I'd strongly recommend that you consider cooperation rather than escalation. The silver-haired man who'd been supporting Victoria's pressure tactics pulled out his phone, presumably to call for backup or escape coordination, but Sullivan shook his head. I'm afraid cellular service in this immediate area has been temporarily disrupted as a security measure. You're quite isolated at the moment. Victoria finally found her voice, though it carried none of the honeyed confidence she displayed earlier. This is harassment. We came here to provide legitimate financial services to Mrs. Davidson, and now we're being threatened by private security contractors with no legal authority. Actually, Sullivan replied, pulling out official identification, I should have introduced myself more completely. James Sullivan, Special Agent in Charge, FBI Financial Crimes Task Force. The private consulting work was my cover identity for this operation. The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. Victoria and her associates weren't just facing exposure. They were looking at federal criminal charges that would likely result in life sentences. Ms. Ashford, Sullivan continued, You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your associates are similarly charged, and I suspect we'll be adding quite a few more counts as we analyze tonight's recorded evidence. As Sullivan's backup team entered the house, real FBI agents, not private security, Victoria made one last desperate attempt to maintain control of the situation. "Marcus," she called out as handcuffs were produced, "tell them this is all a misunderstanding. Explain how Isabella has been having emotional problems since her father's death. How she's been paranoid and irrational about her financial management." But Marcus, faced with the choice between protecting Victoria and protecting what remained of his own future, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. "No, Victoria," he said quietly. "I won't lie anymore. Isabella's been right about everything. You used me to steal from her. And when I realized how far you were willing to go, I was too scared to stop you." The admission sealed Victoria's fate while potentially saving Marcus from the worst consequences of his involvement. As the FBI agents processed the arrests, I found myself watching the woman who'd been planning my destruction, reduced to someone whose own carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "Mrs. Morrison," Sullivan said, using my correct name for the first time that evening, "there are some additional matters we need to discuss about the scope of this investigation. Victoria's network has been operating internationally for several years, and your case has provided the evidence we needed to dismantle the entire operation." As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she turned back toward me with an expression of pure malice. "This isn't over, Isabella. We have people you'll never see coming. Resources you can't imagine. You think you've won something tonight, but you've just painted a target on yourself that will never disappear." The threat was clearly intended to intimidate me, but after everything I'd endured and overcome in the past 12 hours, Victoria Ashford no longer seemed like an unstoppable predator. She seemed like exactly what she was, a criminal whose schemes had finally caught up with her. "Ms. Ashford," I replied calmly, "I think you're forgetting something important. I'm not the helpless victim you thought you were targeting. I'm Isabella Morrison, daughter of a man who built a tech empire from nothing, and I've just learned that I inherited more than his money. I inherited his ability to destroy people who threaten the things he cared about." As the FBI agents led Victoria away into the night, I realized that the storm that had begun this evening was finally ending, both literally and metaphorically. The rain was stopping, the wind was dying down, and the forces that had been trying to destroy my life were being removed in handcuffs. But Sullivan's mention of additional matters suggested that tonight's revelations were just the beginning of a larger story, and that the true scope of what I'd uncovered was far greater than even I had imagined. 6 months after that stormy October night, I stood in the federal courthouse in Chicago, watching Victoria Ashford receive a sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge's words echoed through the packed courtroom as he described her crimes as a systematic campaign of financial terrorism against vulnerable individuals that culminated in multiple planned murders. The investigation that began with my recording devices had ultimately exposed an international network spanning 12 countries, with over 200 victims and stolen assets exceeding $400 million. Victoria's organization hadn't just been stealing inheritances, they'd been destroying lives with industrial efficiency. "Mrs. Morrison," Agent Sullivan approached me as we left the courthouse, "I wanted to personally thank you for your courage in testifying. Without your willingness to face these people directly, dozens of other victims would never have seen justice." The trials had been emotionally exhausting, requiring me to relive that night and its aftermath, while facing Victoria's legal team's attempts to portray me as a delusional heiress who'd fabricated the entire conspiracy. But the recordings didn't lie, and the paper trail of stolen assets spoke louder than any defense attorney's spin. "What happens to the other victims?" I asked, thinking about the faces I'd seen during months of testimony: elderly widows, grieving children, struggling families who'd lost everything to Victoria's network. "The asset recovery process is ongoing," Sullivan replied. "We've located approximately $280 million in hidden accounts, and the international courts are cooperating with repatriation efforts. It won't restore everything that was stolen, but it's more than we usually recover in cases like this." The restitution process had become a passion project for me. Working with federal prosecutors and international law enforcement, we developed new protocols for tracking assets hidden through shell companies and offshore accounts. The Morrison Foundation had funded a legal aid program specifically designed to help fraud victims navigate the complex recovery process. As we walked down the courthouse steps, I caught sight of a familiar figure waiting by a taxi. Dorothy Williams, the driver who'd saved my life that stormy night, had become an unexpected friend and one of my strongest supporters throughout the trial process. "How'd it go in there, honey?" Dorothy asked as I approached her cab. "Did they give that woman what she deserved?" "Life without parole," I replied, still processing the finality of it. "She'll never hurt anyone else again." Dorothy nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Now, where are we heading? You've got that board meeting at 3. And traffic's going to be heavy with the construction on Lakeshore Drive." Over the past 6 months, Dorothy had become more than just my preferred taxi driver. She'd become my unofficial security consultant and trusted friend. Her street wisdom and protective instincts had proven invaluable as I'd navigated the challenges of rebuilding my life while testifying in multiple criminal cases. The board meeting Dorothy mentioned was for the new Morrison Institute for Financial Security, an organization I'd established using part of my recovered assets to help other fraud victims. The institute provided legal support, financial counseling, and most importantly, the kind of protective surveillance network that had saved my life. "Dorothy," I said as we drove through downtown Chicago, "do you ever think about that night? About how different everything could have been if you'd taken the bribe Victoria's people offered you?" She glanced at me in the rearview mirror with the same penetrating wisdom I'd come to rely on. "Isabella, honey, I think about it every day, but not because I regret my choice. Because it reminds me that ordinary people have more power than they realize when they choose to do the right thing." Her words captured something profound about the entire experience. Victoria's network had succeeded for years because they'd counted on people's willingness to look the other way, to avoid getting involved, to prioritize their own safety over others' welfare. The night Dorothy refused their bribe and Sullivan's team activated my father's protection protocols, ordinary people had chosen to be extraordinary. The Morrison Institute occupied 3 floors of a downtown building that had once housed one of my father's early tech companies. As we pulled up to the entrance, I could see through the glass walls to the bustling activity inside. Investigators tracking down fraud networks, lawyers preparing victim advocacy cases, and counselors helping people rebuild their lives after financial devastation. Mrs. Morrison, my assistant Sarah Chen, greeted me as I entered the lobby. "The board is assembled, and we have several urgent matters to discuss. The Singapore authorities have requested assistance with a case that appears to follow Victoria's network's patterns." The international scope of our work had surprised everyone, including me. What had begun as personal revenge against the people who'd tried to destroy my life had evolved into a global movement against financial predation. Law enforcement agencies from 6 continents now regularly consulted with the Morrison Institute about emerging fraud schemes. The boardroom on the 14th floor offered a spectacular view of Lake Michigan, where storm clouds were gathering for what meteorologists predicted would be another severe weather system. But unlike that night 6 months ago, the approaching storm filled me with anticipation rather than dread. Storms, I'd learned, revealed who people really were, and I'd discovered I was someone who thrived in difficult conditions. "Ladies and gentlemen," I addressed the board members who'd gathered around the conference table, "before we begin today's agenda, I want to share some personal news that will affect the Institute's future direction." The room grew quiet as I pulled out a document I'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment to share its contents. Yesterday, I received final confirmation that Marcus has completed his cooperation with federal prosecutors in the Victoria Ashford case. His testimony helped secure convictions against 17 additional network members, and he's been accepted into the Witness Protection Program. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions about forgiveness, justice, and the complex emotions involved in watching someone you'd once loved pay the price for their choices. "I know some of you have questioned my decision to advocate for leniency in Marcus's sentencing," I continued. "But I've come to understand that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about preventing future harm and helping victims rebuild their lives." Marcus had received a 5-year sentence in exchange for his cooperation, a resolution that had generated considerable controversy among other fraud victims who felt he deserved harsher punishment. But his testimony had been instrumental in dismantling Victoria's entire network, preventing countless future victims from suffering similar betrayals. More importantly, I said, Marcus's cooperation has provided us with intelligence about emerging fraud schemes that we can use to protect potential victims before they're targeted. The Institute has already prevented an estimated $50 million in theft by identifying and disrupting networks based on patterns Marcus helped us understand. Robert Chen, my father's old business partner who'd triggered the protective surveillance that saved my life, spoke from his position at the far end of the table. Isabella, your father would be proud of what you've built here. He always believed that the best response to adversity was to create systems that prevented others from facing similar challenges. Robert's words carried special weight because he'd known my father longer than anyone else in the room. Their partnership had been built on mutual respect and shared values about using success to create positive change in the world. Which brings me to today's primary agenda item, I said, activating the presentation screen that displayed a map showing global fraud network activities. We've identified what appears to be a new organization operating across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, using methods similar to Victoria's network but with some concerning innovations. The next hour was spent reviewing intelligence reports, financial transaction analyses, and victim testimonies that painted a picture of criminal evolution. The success of the Victoria Ashford prosecutions had forced surviving fraud networks to adapt their methods, becoming more sophisticated and more dangerous in the process. The challenge we face, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, our chief investigator and former FBI financial crime specialist, is that these networks are learning from Victoria's mistakes. They're using more advanced technology, better compartmentalization, and unfortunately, more extreme intimidation tactics against potential witnesses. The briefing concluded with a sobering assessment. The war against financial predation was far from over. If anything, success in dismantling Victoria's network had accelerated an arms race between criminals and the law enforcement agencies trying to stop them. As the board meeting ended and members departed for their various afternoon commitments, I remained in the conference room watching the storm clouds gather over Lake Michigan. The approaching weather system reminded me of that night 6 months ago, when my world had been turned upside down by betrayal and violence. But this time, I wasn't a helpless victim waiting for rescue. I was someone who'd learned to transform personal tragedy into systemic change, who'd discovered that true strength came not from avoiding difficult situations, but from developing the resources to handle whatever challenges arose. My phone buzzed with a text message from Dorothy. "Storm's coming in tonight. You need a ride home, or are you planning to walk through this one too?" Her message made me laugh, remembering how that terrible night had begun with abandonment and despair, but had ultimately led to discoveries about my own resilience and the power of unexpected alliances. I replied, "I'll walk if I need to. Storms don't scare me anymore." It was true. The woman who'd stood shivering at a taxi stand 6 months ago, abandoned by her husband and targeted for murder by international criminals, had been transformed by adversity into someone capable of fighting back against forces that preyed on vulnerable people. As I gathered my materials and prepared to leave the office, I paused at the window overlooking the city where I'd been born, raised, and ultimately reborn through crisis. Chicago's skyline stretched toward the horizon, a testament to human resilience and the capacity to build something greater from the ruins of what had come before. The storm that had nearly destroyed me had instead revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed. Victoria Ashford and her network had tried to reduce me to a helpless victim, but they'd accidentally created their own worst enemy, someone with the resources, intelligence, and determination to ensure that their brand of evil never succeeded again. Tonight, as the storm rolled in over Lake Michigan, I would be safe in my home, surrounded by friends, and protected by security systems that honored my father's memory while defending against threats he could never have imagined. The helicopter that had landed in the park across from my house that terrible night had brought more than just rescue. It had brought the revelation that I was never as alone or as helpless as my enemies had believed. And tomorrow I would continue the work of ensuring that other potential victims discovered their own hidden strengths before predators like Victoria Ashford could destroy their lives. The storm was coming, but Isabella Morrison was ready for it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.